Russian forces have been carrying out their largest ever drone attack on Ukraine, damaging buildings and critical infrastructure in several different regions. A record 188 drones were launched overnight. That's according to the Ukrainian Air Force. In the east, Russian state media claimed that troops had entered the settlement of Velika Novosika in Ukraine's Donetsk region. That's a key defensive stronghold and logistics hub. Well, the Institute for the Study of War, which is a military analysis organisation, has been assessing the Russian offensive campaign since the start of the war in Ukraine. And joining us now is Carolina Hurd, who's deputy lead of the Institute's Russia team. And thank you very much for being with us. And I think your finding, in a nutshell, in recent days is that Russian forces are moving faster and making faster progress than they have pretty much since any time since the start of the war. And I just wondered if you could talk us through that and what it means for Ukraine.
Yes, absolutely, Ben. As you've identified, this is a really critical point in the war because Russians are advancing quicker and more successfully than they really have been for the entirety of 2024 and for most of 2023 as well. We're seeing about a 35-kilometer-long front line in western Donetsk Oblast, eastern Ukraine, between a settlement called Hurakove and then down to the settlement that you named, Velika Novosilka. And we've seen Russian forces advancing on this 35-ish kilometer-long front line over the past week, faster than we've seen in a while. And the way that they're doing this is actually very interesting because instead of attacking Ukrainian frontal positions head on and having to deal with the constraints in maneuver and infantry warfare that they're facing, we've actually seen Russian forces basically pursue envelopments of Ukrainian positions along this front line. So basically identifying where Ukrainian positions are weak, where Ukrainian forces are weak, and trying to encircle that position and force Ukrainian troops to draw back. We've seen this to great effect to some extent in kind of local and tactical scenarios with troops, as far as we have geolocated evidence from yesterday, reaching the eastern outskirts of Velika Novosilka. So essentially, I think it's kind of this coherence of attacking and identifying where Ukraine is weak and also just being able to reinforce those tactical successes by continuing to pursue them on the battlefield.
So, I mean, just to take that in the bigger context, really, of the war, where does that leave Ukraine? Are they running out of time, in a sense, to hold back this Russian advance?
So I think that's an interesting question because we are, on one hand, seeing Russian forces advance quickly and successfully, but they're only really doing this in a meaningful sense in this one sector of the front line that I outlined. The Russian goal has been for years to seize the entirety of Donetsk Oblast. But even if they seize the territory that they're currently pursuing, that still leaves thousands of square kilometers of Donetsk Oblast that they still need to seize. And, you know, we've seen this interplay time and time again, where Russian forces are able to capture significant settlements or whatever it may be, but they really struggle to translate that into further advances on a rapid timeline. So I think that really breaks down to the fact that, yes, this is a concerning situation for Ukraine to be in, but the entire front line in Ukraine is not collapsing. Just because we're seeing Russian forces advance in this area doesn't mean that Russian forces will be in Kiev next week. I think that's a really important thing to remember. Right now, Russia has the upper hand, but that's also not a permanent scenario. We know that they're running out of equipment. We know that their casualty rates are essentially one-to-one with their recruitment rates. So they will run out of personnel at some point. So it's this very tenuous spot that Ukraine is in right now, but it does not portend the collapse of Ukraine's war effort, nor does it, indicate that Russia's victory is imminent in any meaningful way.
And of course, recently we saw, well, a few months ago, we saw that Ukrainian counterattack in Kursk, that incursion into Russian territory, capturing Russian territory. With hindsight, do you think that was perhaps a strategic mistake by the Ukrainians, where they could have used those forces to bolster up these areas that you've been talking about, where they've been on the back foot, or was that perhaps a strategic masterstroke?
So I think we're still too ingrained in the Kursk operation to be able to tell its long-term significance. But I will say that we know that the Kursk incursion has drawn significant amounts of Russian manpower off of the front line in Ukraine to Kursk Oblast, including these kind of higher level, more elite airborne formations or naval infantry formations that were either pursuing offensive operations or pursuing defensive operations within Ukraine. They basically stretched out the Russian force structure a little bit, started applying pressure on Russia domestically. And I think that when we get to the 2025, 2026 window, the impacts of that strategic force reallocation will become much more clear. I think it's a little bit hard to tell in this exact moment because it's still fluid.
OK, well, thank you so much for your analysis. Fascinating. Carolina Hurt there from the Institute for the Study of War. Thank you very much for being with us. Well, following the decision by the US and the UK to allow Ukraine to fire long-range missiles into Russian territory, President Putin announced he was lowering the threshold for the potential use of Russia's nuclear weapons. Well, now, for the first time, a Russian military officer who served inside one of Russia's top-secret nuclear bases has spoken out. The man fled the country after being threatened with deployment to the front line in Ukraine. Our correspondent Will Vernon went to meet him at a secret location outside Russia.
Russia likes to put on a show of its nuclear capabilities. On state TV, Britain is regularly threatened with atomic annihilation. But the question keeping Western politicians up at night, would Putin really push the nuclear button? This man worked on the inside. A former officer in the elite nuclear forces, he was stationed at a top-secret base in Russia.
The troops are there to either repel or carry out a nuclear strike. There's a very strict selection process. There are constant checks and lie detector tests. It's a closed society. There are no strangers there. If you want your parents to visit, you need to submit a request to the FSB security service 3 months in advance.
To protect Anton, we're not revealing his location or his identity. He showed us documents which confirmed his story, as well as details of his service at the nuclear base.
On the day the war started, we were put on full combat readiness and shut in the base. The weapons were fully in place and we were ready to the maximum extent. The state of alert was cancelled after 2 or 3 weeks.
Part of Russia's nuclear arsenal dates from the Soviet era. Some experts say it might not even work.
That's a very simplified view from so-called experts. Russia has an enormous arsenal and a huge amount of warheads and constant patrol on land, sea and air. The weapons are fully operational and battle-ready. Maintenance work never stops, not even for 1 minute.
Obviously, you know secret information. How concerned are you that the Russian authorities might try and track you down?
The FSB, the Interior Ministry, local police, they're all looking for me. I realise I could be kidnapped and taken to Russia by plane. Now, I try to help other soldiers to flee. I understand the more that I do that, the higher the chances they could try and kill me.
Human rights groups say the number of Russian soldiers fleeing the war is increasing, and the Kremlin will be increasingly nervous about people like Anton speaking out. Will Vernon, BBC News.